We're going to call this meeting to order at 9:02. It's July 23rd, 2019, and this is our budget workshop. We are in the Joe N. Idolette Junior Teacher Education Center. I want to bring attention to Mrs. Rosario is on the line for the workshop, and Good morning, and Mr. Bergeron might be joining us later, who is the consultant that we have that has helped us through the budget. So at this time, I'm going to turn the workshop over to Dr. Moxley.
Good morning, members of the board. Thank you for being here. And Mrs. Rosario, we appreciate you joining us by phone. I know you're enjoying time with your family, so thank you for taking the time to be here today. We do have some new faces as part of our workshop here, and I'd like to make those introductions. First of all, Ron Fagan is here with us. He's our new Chief Financial Officer, and we're thrilled to have him here.
Glad to be here.
So thank you very much, and he will be walking us through our budget process this morning with the assistance of our Director of Finance, Kim Copeman. And I do want to take the time to recognize Kim for all her hard work in keeping things rolling and moving forward above and beyond doing the day-to-day operations. We also have two representatives joining us here. We have John Ford, who will be here to give some expertise and answer questions regarding the TAN process, and Ritesh Patel is also here. So we thank both of you for being here this morning. So at this point in time, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Fagan.
Good morning. Thank you very much. First on the agenda is the 2018-19 budget review. Don't have a handout for that right now because we're still in the process of settling up 18-19, closing the books, double-checking the numbers, and getting prepared. Hope to have something for that in about a week to 10 days. We do have an ending fund balance right now, which we'll get to in just a moment. So we do know what our ending fund balance is, but that number could slightly change between now and when we go with the final budget.
And Mr. Fagan, am I correct to understand that we will have materials all for the hearing?
Yes, ma'am.
Next Tuesday.
Yes, ma'am.
Is our hearing, and so board members will have all of that
Yes,
in
ma'am.
their hands before that meeting.
Yes, ma'am. That's correct.
We have been working through a little hiccup with Focus, the Focus system, and so they're having to go back and go line by line to make sure that we don't have a system error at this point in time, that we're making sure everything is in place.
That's correct. The transition is still having some stumbling blocks as we go along. Okay. For the 1920 budget, we do have a handout.
Dr. Moxley, on that 18-19 budget, we will get that, I don't want to get it the day of the hearing. Are we gonna get it?
No, you will get that ahead of time. We're working on Friday
Yes,
as a
ma'am.
timeline. And the 18-19 is the closeout of this year. As they're doing that, that's where the stumbling piece has come through Focus. It will not hinder us in moving forward with approving the budget for next year with that, so,
That's right.
yeah.
For the 1920 tentative budget review, just want to make sure everyone's clear. What we're basically asking the board to do tonight is to approve the ads that will go into paper on Friday. This meets the trim requirements for Department of Revenue that we notify the public of what our tentative trim figures are going to be and our tentative budget. So it's not approving the real budget, you're just approving the trim ads to be published on Friday. Then on the 30th, we come in.
Good morning. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's Mr. Fagan who's speaking. Can you speak into the microphone?
Yes, ma'am. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Would you like for me to repeat what I just stated?
If you don't mind, thank you so much.
No problem. Just want to remind everyone that what we're asking for tonight is the approval of the trim ads, which will be published on Friday. The trim ads are required by Florida statute to notify the public of any changes in the millage rates and the millage rates that will be basically on their trim notice next year. On the 30th, we'll be actually approving the tentative budget. On the first page of the handout is I wanted to start with where we are for 18-19 as far as the ending fund balance. Ending fund balance is approximately $16 million. Your revenue was approximately $150 million, which means you're ending 18-19 with 11% ending fund balance overall. I believe last year you had about a 12%, but that was tentative, okay? So you're ending last year approximately the same percentage rate you ended the prior year. Again, these are tentative. We're still finishing up 18-19. That number could change. For 19-20,
We have a question.
And I think I already know the answer, but the imbalance isn't taken in consideration, the previous negotiations with our labor unions, correct?
no, ma'am, that's just
Okay.
that's a straight ending fund balance calculation.
So whatever we pay for the labor unions, it will come out of this.
It will come out of next year's budget. We'll have a separate appropriation line for that once we finish the 19-20 budget.
That may not have answered your question. So what happens, and correct me if I'm stating it not on point, because of the time where we are, there is a point in time where we have to close
Right.
18-19. And even though there may be things that are going on, if there are open POs, they will then move and be opened in 19-20. The revenues that were earmarked for that will roll to address those POs that will now be open. All of that is factored into the closeout of the 18-19 and the opening of the 19-20. So there is a point certain where everything, we don't talk about 18-19 anymore, and it's now being picked up and will be shown on the 19-20 school year. The same thing with now anything, so we'll know, okay, if this is our ending fund, let's say that 11% is correct. That will then roll over and that will factor into the 19-20 budget. Whatever things that were earmarked that will become open POs will then be, a line itemed or earmarked for that. Anything that is part of a collective bargaining would be then reflected in the 19-20 school year, with this being reflective as the carry forward.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
thank you.
Okay. For 19-20, we have estimated projected revenue of $155 million. Your appropriations right now, again, we're still working on those, is $162 million, which means we have a slight deficit of $7.6 million. Again, this deficit here is typical for the district. It was last year, I think it was $9 million. Taking the $16 million beginning fund balance, backing out the 7.6, the projected ending fund balance right now, budgeted for 19-20, would be your $8.8 million. Based on the revenue of $155 million, that means you have approximately a 5.92 budgeted ending fund balance for 19-20. And I believe the board has a 5% minimum budgeted ending fund balance. Might change a little bit between now and the tentative, and will definitely change for the final. But right now, we're trying to do what we can to maintain that 5% budgeted ending fund balance.
Questions?
Tim is available for us to call in.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. McDonald.
Any questions there on the ending fund balance and budgeted beginning fund balance?
Why don't we take a short little recess to get
Okay.
him on the...
We're going to take a break for 5 minutes. We'll come back at 9:16 so we can get Mr. Bergeron on the phone. meeting back to order. We're having a little technical difficulty getting our consultant on the line. So I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Moxley.
Okay, we will continue, and we're working off of the board workshop amendment, where we have the 1920 tentative budget review. We'll talk about the board's budget, and then we'll do the TAN update. So right now, we're in the process of talking about the 1920 budget. So, Mr. Fagan, if you'll continue, please.
Thank you. Any questions on the ending or projected ending fund balance for 1920? All tentative as of right now. Okay. Next on page 3 is a visual chart of the entire 1920 budget for all your funds, as well as a comparison to 1819. Overall, the budget went up $8.1 million, or approximately 3%. General operating went up about $168,000. Debt went up 1.4. That's primarily attributed to your sinking fund requirements for your QSEB's debt. Capital projects increased $1.1 million. That's a
You probably want to speak a little closer to the mic so Mrs. Rosario can hear you.
The increase in capital projects is a result of additional revenue and additional fund balance rolling over. Food service had additional revenue and ending fund balance in the food service account. Federal only is up about $300,000. Insurance is showing a $3.4 million increase, and we're still looking at that. Some of those numbers don't track back to the projections that were supposed to be for 1819. Could be a focus issue. We're still looking into that. And the enterprise is up to $400,000, and that's attributed to a higher ending fund balance and a higher beginning fund balance for the fund.
If I could comment on this, I think this is important for everyone to look at, and we will put this out on our web for the public that are very interested in following our budget process. Because sometimes when you look and you go to the bottom line and you say, that okay, that's a 3% increase. But yet, when you go back to our day-to-day operating budget, it's not a 3% increase. A lot of our increases come in our other specialty areas or specialized areas that are very targeted. So if it's facilities or capital projects, it's in that area, and there's specific things that you can operate from. So if you really look at our general operating fund, it really only went up $168,000 in that area. But these other areas, for whatever rollover or adjustments that are made. So I think this is important. We do believe in the group insurance because of that one being so critical. At this point in time, we are going back and really looking at that one line by line. So for the reasons that Mr. Fagan noted. Okay.
Mrs. Berenberg had a question.
Will we have that group insurance information for Tuesday's hearing?
Yes, ma'am. We
Okay,
plan.
can we get that information as soon as it's available?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Next page, page 4. Page 4 is a comparison by basically your FEFP calculation, from the fourth calculation of 1819 to your second calculation for 1920. This is an indication of any changes that the legislation made in their allocation of funds to us, primarily like in the BSA on line 4. Gave us an extra $75 per student, which is about a 1.79 increase. FTE went slightly down, 156 FTE down from the prior fourth calculation. Still researching that. I can't answer the question right now if that's charter schools or our schools. I'm trying to find the data that backs that in. The 17,268 is indeed our projection for next year, but I'm trying to obtain the backup to what is the total for charter schools and what is the total for our schools. Gross FEFP, line 18, we picked up $1 million, or basically 1%. This is what I like to call your discretionary and non-discretionary money. As Dr. Moxley was saying, you picked up $1 million in your BSA, but you lost $400,000 in your digital. Many of these funds are specific. You can only use them for specific things. Class size, digital, reading, mental health, best and brightest. Best and brightest you see is an increase of $1.7 million, and that is because last year they gave it to the district later in the year, and it was just an additional funding source. This year they put in the beginning at FEFP. So it looks like you gained $1 million there, but actually the $1.7 million was related to best and brightest. So you didn't really gain the $1 million.
Can I ask about digital? How did we lose that money?
I don't know the specific answer to that question. That's one we'll have to research, but we can do that unless, Mr. Fagan, you know that answer.
The best I can tell you is the allocation from the state. When they do the FEFP calculation, they determine by category who gets what, but I will look in the FEFB second calc to see if I can see anything that jumps out at me.
Right, because in the FEFP, it looks like we went up, so why would our digital go down?
My experience with FEFP, they'll rob from Peter to pay Paul. If something comes up that they need to make an increase, such as safety, well, they generally take it from somewhere else. They don't always give you exactly what you got last year or an increase in your BSA, and then say, oh, by the way, we need more security, here's another $2 million. They generally will rob from Peter to pay Paul,
Do they do that by district, or do they
Yes.
do that across the board?
across the board.
It may be that the factor that they multiply
Right.
by has been changed.
So that would affect all districts?
That
not
would
just
affect all
ours?
districts.
Yes.
And we can go back into the detail.
Okay,
of
yeah,
that.
I like to
Yeah.
check on that,
Yeah.
because usually you don't see that number drop like that.
Yeah, I don't
Correct.
know whether I
Okay.
brought it with me. We'll research that for sure.
Now, of course, any drop in your FTE will affect your allocation as well. But we had a slight drop of 156.
Okay, so,
But if that was attributed to all your allocations,
Right.
you'd see all your allocations would be red.
Right.
Just digital is. So it has to do something with their allocation of funding to us
okay.
across the board.
Excuse me, if I may I have a moment? I just want to apologize for my tardiness this morning. As many of you might know, but I'll share it today, I lost my father at the end of May. Today is his birthday. It's a bit of a hard day for my family, and so my start to my morning wasn't the same as it normally would be. So I just want to apologize again for my tardiness. I will do my best today to focus and to be as present as possible. Thank you.
414.
We're on page 4, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
Line 18 is what we just talked about.
Next, if we look at your RLE, that went down $343,000. That would be because of your decrease in your millage rates. As you know, when your property values go up, generally your millage rate goes down, okay? And then since Indian River is a property rich, therefore we get most of our money from our property taxes. So even though property values, if you look at the top on line 3, actually went up 6%, over $1 billion, well, millage rate has a tendency then to go in the inverse relationship. Got our budget for McKay, class size went down 102,000. So overall, your total state funding, net to net, went up $600,000. Your required local effort went up 1.1, to give us all the district overall an increase of approximately 3.5 million. And of course, as you know, the second calc, third calc, and fourth calc will all be adjusted every time it comes out, based on FTE and any other changes.
It does appear on the digital classrooms, and I'd have to go back and look at the calculations from last year, Mrs. Berenborg, that they've changed the formula
Funding.
They have.
for it.
Okay.
Yes, because every district is in the $200,000 to $300,000 adjustment like ours is.
Okay.
You know, we are at 261,000. I'm looking at most districts are in that, other than like Dade, Miami-Dade, it's proportionate being larger, but nobody has gotten any, I don't see any district that got even over $500,000.
May I? Thank you. So as we prepare our legislative platform, what an interesting point. There used to be a time when we didn't receive as much of a digital allocation, right, technology allocation, and the district had gone out for a millage in order to supplement some of that because we had infrastructure needs that we needed to do, to address. And we had gone out for that original millage, which was the .6, which was teachers, technology, and textbooks, because we also weren't receiving the textbook allocation at that time. I just think it's interesting how cyclical it seems to be that the funding is, and as we address that going forward in our legislative platform, I think this would be something, if we could note, to say, technology continues to increase, the use of technology in our classrooms and with STEM education, and yet the allocation is being decreased again. So just something to note going forward.
Thank you.
All right, any questions on the calculation, FAFP. Page 5. Page 5 is just a visual chart of comparing your budget from 1819 to 1920. This chart is primarily talking about your revenue. Ties back to the front page of your $8.1 million increase. It's just a visual of the front chart of showing where, if you look across between your state sources, you were 49 million, you're still at about 49 million, slight increase. Local is up 153 to 157. Beginning fund balances up about $1 million, 48 to 49. Transfers 17 to 17, and then your federal sources 20 to 23. The increases are very similar to what I mentioned before. You got 8.2 million overall. State was up 415,000, primarily the FEFP in your prior period millage. Local increased about 3.7. That's attributed to your higher property values. Fund balances increased 1.2 over the prior year. This is just additional roll forward, but remember that's currently under review. That could go down and it could go up. And non-revenue sources, the 274, it appears last year we had a little bit more budgeted for the sale of surplus equipment and material, and we bumped it back down to 50,000 this year. Federal sources increased about 3.1. This is primarily an increases in entitlement grants, non-entitlement grants, and food service. The chart at the bottom is just a visual, again, of the change in your fund balances. Fund balances are very important, and so we like to highlight that. Your general fund decreased $2.1 million. Basically means over the revenue actually collected in your expenditures, you had to tap into your ending fund balance to close out 1819. Exactly why, I can't tell you, because we're still reviewing 1819. I can't tell you if it was supplies or teacher salaries or overall personnel salaries. We're still doing that review right now. Special revenue went down $800,000. That is primarily attributed to food service. Food service spent down their ending fund balance to do more equipment, materials, and updates in the cafeterias. And I believe that was a known factor that was going to happen this year.
Can I ask you a question? Because we are in this transition period, I understand that you've been here 1 week, but next year when we look at this, at this point in time, would you have already had clarification on all this?
Yes, and the reason
Okay.
is because my timing here and also focus, we're still struggling with the focus transition.
Okay.
When we got into the end of the year, there were still some issues. When we were here, we've noticed some things regarding some revenue that wasn't in the right spot. We knew we had the revenue, it just wasn't being recorded. We had to get focused on the line and figure out what we were doing. Some of it was user errors, and some of it was functionality. The functionality was supposed to do X and it did Y, but now focus had to go fix that.
One of the things that was an aha moment for me the last 2 weeks is that I didn't realize how new Focus is in the district, that it really has been in the finance area since January.
There was a transition happened over Christmas time.
And to be honest, I think they've done remarkably well for a 5-month implementation of it. But I think now, and we've been on the phone this past week with the vendor and the representatives and working through different things that, again, at this point in time, we want to make sure our numbers, it's not a mechanical, technical, we're not trusting or verifying, the information. And I think that was kind of the opportunity we were faced with this week with that. But that was, I thought Focus had been in place for a little
Well,
bit
and just
longer.
a note to that, I know other districts that have transitioned into Focus, like Manatee County, for example, has struggled for months and months and months with implementation. So, I know we've said to Greg McDonald and his team before, thank you for such a great implementation. I know everyone worked over Christmas to make that happen, and Kim was a big part of that. So thank you, Kim. But it is not seamless.
Right.
It takes quite a bit,
It
so.
does. It
And
does.
I just wanted to say, they have been very supportive.
They have
They
been.
are reacting to any request or
Right.
anything that we come up with. They're
Okay.
So I just wanted to point out that even though we don't have all this clarification right now, it's not the norm. There are a lot of things going on behind the scenes. It's the reason we don't have complete clarification of this. But next year, it's definitely going to be better.
Yes, ma'am.
And
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Very optimistic.
Yes, I think it will be great next year.
Also in the transition, remember, I believe we came live January, December? Okay. When you started that, you started to make sure you got people paid on time, vendors were paid on time, normal day-to-day operations. This is your first year in. A lot of things you do at year end, you don't do every month. And so you don't see or recognize, and you're not checking as closely because you're putting out fires day to day. When you get to year end, now I have to slow down to make sure it's all right. And now that's when we notice some things going on.
Thank you.
The next page, 5, is a review of allocated funds. So the first page was revenue. This is by source. This is revenue where it's allocated by fund type. Again, $8.1 million increase. It's just a visualization of your general fund. Went from 171 million to 171 million, a slight increase of 168,000. Internal, 26 million to 30 million. That's the one we're looking at to make sure we're still comfortable with that. That ending fund balance is a little higher than we expected based upon what I'd heard about claims and revenue, and there's something's amiss there. Or it is true, and claims are actually less than what we expected. Green is the special revenue fund, 11 to 11. Purple is the food service fund, slight increase there, not very much. Capital projects, 42 to 44. This is an increase in revenue from your property taxes and additional fund balance that rolled from the prior year. But it's just a visualization by allocation of how your funds are doing compared to the prior year. As you can see in the right-hand side, there's a percentage chart. As Dr. Moxley pointed out, general fund, basically you did not have an increase in general fund, 0%. Internal increase, 12%. That's primarily attributed to the ending fund balance that we're still looking at. Special revenue federal, 3%. Food, 9%. Capital, 20. Capital is 3%. Enterprise, 21, all the way down to your 3%. Just a visualization of your change in your allocations. Still under review, subject to change. But compared to last year, you're pretty much on target.
I'd just like to point out the enterprise fund, which that is the after-school program we're talking about, correct? Which, I'm seeing that 21% increase there, but yet we increased the fees, so was it really necessary to increase those fees? So I know that's something we're gonna look at.
That is something we need to look at, because one of the things that, if there is an increase in enrollment, then there needs to be an increase going into this year of staffing, but, to work with the numbers of children and the ratio, which that needs to be looked at, and then balanced out so that we should not be having a large carry forward. And this appears to indicate that we did.
Didn't we also vote on giving them an increase in pay? Wasn't that the after-school program?
Yes.
Yes, it was, because of the competitive rates.
That wasn't reflected in this past year's budget. That will be
Right.
reflected in
That's
this
correct.
next year's budget, so
That's
that's a point to
correct.
make.
That's
That we need
correct.
to look at that.
Yep.
Because
That is
that's,
correct.
even though we looked at, okay, we're up 6%, we didn't include that.
That is correct. You will see higher expenditures because of the increase in competitive wages there, and, again, the numbers.
Another possibility that it could be that ran in my experience with prior districts is you collect the money for summer in May and June, but I haven't paid it. If I haven't paid it, it's going to be in your fund balance and roll and paid in July. So it's the timing of you've paid me
That's
all
good.
summer, but I haven't paid it out. So I'm going to have this artificially high ending, but you really can't look at that because I haven't paid that bill yet.
I think what will be critical is for us to take a look at that, where they are come the first week of school, and about September 1st.
Yep.
Okay. Any questions on page 6? I'm moving on to page 7. This is just a quick overview of the millage for the district. For 1920, your millage will be 6.5690. This does include your prior period funding millage adjustment, so there should not be any change between this and your tentative and your final millage. We were able to get that in before presentation today. This is lower than the rate from last year, which was 4.045, which is also attributed to the higher increase in property values. Local capital still is 1.5. Your basic discretionary is still 7.480, and of course, you have your DOM, your additional discretionary millage, the 0.5. So you really only affected was because of your change in your RLE, which is directly attributed to the increase in your property values. Chart at the bottom is just a historical chart of where you used to be at 7.41 in 16-17, and now the district is down to 6.5690, which is attributed also because of the continued increase in the property values over the last 5 years.
Mrs. Sork? When we talk about increased property value and our required local effort, and we're getting more money locally, and we're going to have a conversation about the TAM, we're obviously going to vote on that. As we are more and more dependent on local property tax, how does that affect our cash flow when we get into November, October? Can you talk a little bit about that in your understanding?
The way that I understand and looked at the cash flow requirements, we'll start off with July and August with plenty of cash. Going to September and October is when you start getting hit, and that's when you start to run negative. And your first big checks do not come in until November.
So if a district is not as property rich as we are, do they have that same issue?
That are not as property rich, no, because they get most of their money through FEFP.
And so is that more of a stable funding mechanism throughout the year where your money, you're receiving money in a more?
Correct. If you're getting $100 million in 12 equal installments, you're going to be getting those in the first 3 months of the year. That helps with your cash flow. Duval was like that. Duval was property poor. We got most of our money through FEFP. You weren't in that situation. You got most of your money from your FEFP. You had a good rollover balance, so you always had a positive cash balance.
So you never were so flush with cash and then all of a sudden you were cash, right, okay.
I don't think one is more stable than the other. I think it's the consistent payout from the state. It's just, you get them in these increments that are throughout the year.
But because of
whereas
that-
with property values, you don't.
And but districts who have higher property values, you have to make different decisions.
You do. You definitely do.
And it's through no fault of a financial team that you have to make those decisions. It's just an observation that I think is something that our community in general, or just people in general, if you're not familiar with school funding, is a misconception that I think it's important for us to highlight.
So the state the counties, they are getting the funding from the FEFP. When do they get the bulk of their payments?
From the FEFP,
Yes.
every month. They get
Consistent.
They get it every month?
consistent.
consistent every
Okay.
month. So if you're getting $120 million every month, you're getting $10 million.
Okay.
So you get that cash flow, even though it's class-size money. Well, if I get $10 million in class-size money, I'm not spending $10 million in class-size money. I can use that cash to pay other bills.
And how much do we get per month?
That's,
Oh, no, you don't have to pull that out of your hat, but I just want you to go back, when you said we're negative, we're not technically negative. We have funds in other buckets, but we're not supposed to be touching those buckets. Can you explain that?
I'm still researching that
Okay.
comment. Based upon the analysis we did, this is all the cash the district has, regardless if it's capital or whatever. It's all in the same bank account. It is in Bank of New, it is in, not Bank of America, it is in Wells Fargo's, and we have 2 investment houses. Now, all that cash is swept daily to pay out through a centralized bank account at Wells. So I have to do more research on that comment.
But we've talked before about flexibility of funds, and there are things that we're able to flex, different allocations that you're able, that have some ability to do that, and there are some that you can't, and so maximizing the opportunities, I think, is something that we haven't always taken advantage of, but is incredibly important for us to do.
And to answer your question, we get about 2.2 million monthly.
Okay.
From FFP.
And then our payroll is about 8.5.
It's about 3.6 just for payroll alone.
But then FR.
Every 2 weeks, 3.6? Right, so times 2 times,
Would be
Insure plus
just
health
under
nine.
plus FRS.
And
yeah.
our vendor payments.
Then your accounts payable and your
Right.
capital projects, so.
right. So when we'll have that conversation when we get there.
Okay.
Okay.
Page 8 is just a quick visualization of the property values over the last 4 years. 16, 17, the district was about 16.4 billion. 19, 20, we're projected to be 19.9, or basically an increase of 6%, or 1.1 billion over the prior year, which is expected and kind of universal across the state of Florida.
And I think it's also important to point out that while you may see an increase in property values that might equate to more money to the district, that isn't, then the FEFP model is adjusted
Goes down.
back, so you're getting your money from the local, required local effort, but you're reducing your state FEFP funds. So I think from a community standpoint, people will say, well, you've got an increase in your property value, so you have more money, but it really doesn't equate to that because it goes into the formula and balances out. So we may be getting more money over here, but we're getting less money from the state.
And the RLE is adjusted at the state
That's
level.
correct.
So even though property values continue to increase, the legislature can choose to roll back the RLE so that, because it's seen as a tax increase to
Right.
people. That's, again, something that I think the county commission is able to set their millage rates in order to be able to meet needs. And I've discussed this before, and I'd like to just say it again if I could. Things like fire and police are considered essential services, and I've heard that said before. Education is an essential service, and yet we aren't able to set the millage, which we just aren't, to meet the needs of our community. And it's just something, as we move forward with the legislative platform, that I think is important for us to note. Education is an essential service, and I think when we look at the statute, it says, that education, public education is a fundamental, I know that's written in statute, a fundamental service, that education is an essential service. If we could maybe put that in the top line.
Very good. Okay. Rollback rate for this year is actually higher, it's by about 1.2%. When you do the calculation per Department of Revenue, if your rollback rate is higher than your prior year, you have to notice a public tax increase. Okay, even though each taxpayer may not suffer a tax increase, you still have to make the public announcement that it is a tax increase and have a different ad. On page 9 is a chart kind of giving a visualization. If my property values went up 6% and my millage rates from 1819 were 6.793, and for 1920 are 6.599, that's a slight increase overall in your millage rates. But what does that mean to a taxpayer, a homeowner? The second box is an example of a home tax home bill for an individual whose property value did not increase. Just because overall taxes increase, depending on where you live, your tax property value may not have increased. In this example, based upon the prior year millage rates and this year millage rates, that individual will actually see a decrease of $33. That's 100% attributed to the RLE. Okay. The next example is a sample home tax bill for an individual where they had a 6% increase in property values, but they have a 3% Save Our Homes cap. Overall net, they would actually see a $5 increase. So even though we went up 6, they didn't quite go up the same value. The one at the bottom is an individual maybe who doesn't have the option of the 3%. They actually going to see a $45 increase.
There was a bill that was proposed in the legislature this year that if you had lived in your home for a certain amount of time, that you would no longer have to pay property tax and pay into public education. What an interesting bill. That somehow, if you're retired, that public education or the educating of our youth is not something that's important or something that you have a responsibility to be a part of. Going forward, again, Mrs. Sorick, with our legislative platform, that anything like that, just the fact that it was proposed, I don't think it had any real teeth to move forward, but just the fact that I think it was proposed was scary to me as a citizen of the United States. So if we could maybe make a note about, again, anything like that would be extremely disappointing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a conversation this week with our legislator about this exact thing. And, she understands, she shares our concerns, she wants more information. Dr. Moxley and I have talked about what she needs for information for something to move forward. That would be a good discussion for our legislative platform, I think. But I also think that we need to educate our public. I hear out there that people think, well, you know, property values are going up, so therefore the schools have more money. What's going on? How come you need more money? You have more money. They don't understand that just because property values go up doesn't mean that the district gets more money. Flat out, what you're saying. We just need to put it in layman's terms because they don't understand the formula that we're dealing with.
No, and because the county operates that they can raise their millage based on need.
Right.
If they need a firehouse, they can raise that millage so they can pay for that firehouse, like in VLE when they did that. And people say, well, it's fire. That's an essential service. We have to have that. You know, education is the same. And I think we are dealing in an unfair place, but we have to work harder to advocate.
But I think that what we need to do is make them understand that the more taxes go up, the money doesn't necessarily go to the schools, the local schools.
But how do we advocate as a school board? And maybe Dr. Moxley can help with that, because I don't think that we've done a very good job of that. And I know we have joined FSBA, but I don't know that FSBA has always been extremely successful in their advocacy in that way. And I think going forward, we have to take a stronger stand. I really do.
Well, I think we're one of the districts that are in that little niche of having this issue. And you sent us some information on that, thank you, this week, because I asked how many districts are in the same situation we're in. And it's few compared to 67 districts. How many was it? 13, 15? 13.
But we'd be so much stronger if we all got together and
Right.
worked together.
That's kind of where my conversation was
sorry.
going
Yeah.
with our legislator.
Yeah, let's do that.
Was understanding what districts are in the same situation we're in.
It's very smart.
So since we're on, I don't know when this would come in, but I did want to hand this out to, and Mrs. Justice had seen this, but this, I believe this was back in 2017, 18. We did have on our platform level funding, and I think that's something that we need to, it's the second one. I think it's something we need to look at again, but I wanted to hand this out. Okay.
I think it's a huge issue for us. We really need to look at this because we're in this situation again this year with a tan.
Well, and we're going to put ourselves in a better situation, which I'm happy and excited about.
Than last
But
year.
again, I mean, you know,
Because of
shame
market-
on us if we're not really advocating for our community the way that we're supposed to.
But
We had it there, you're right.
market conditions are good this year.
Yep.
We look at,
You're
before,
right.
they weren't
They
there.
weren't as good, you're right.
So, we don't know where it's gonna be next year.
You're right.
And
Okay.
All right. Next page, is we're getting into the actual ads that we're seeking board approval to publish in Friday's paper. First ad is the proposed tax increase. This is a format set by the Department of Revenue. We can't change the wording, or only thing we're allowed to do is change the numbers. So this basically is an indication that we have a slight increase, 1.2%, I believe it is, 1.29, increase in the RLE, which therefore requires this ad to be posted. These figures will not track back to any other items you'll find in any other agenda items. They come from the DS 420S, so they won't necessarily be in an agenda item. These values here are property values at 100% value. Recall, we budget at 96%. So if you ever take this out later and go back and find the agenda items in September, they won't tie back. It's a very strange calculation. The next ad is your capital school outlay. This is your standard ad for spending all your 1.5 mils. Approximate budget right now is at $28.6 million. The millage at the top you see is the 5.0690. That's your other millage. If you remember, the millage rate for next year is 6.5690. You take the 1.5 out of that number, and that's that net number. Again, this is a Department of Revenue prescribed format. They're basically letting the reader know that we're assessing $1.5 million here, but the district is also assessing a different mill for all their required local effort, discretion, et cetera. Just to help the reader tie the numbers back together. We reviewed all the projects here compared to what was done last year. I believe we had a couple of audits on the ad. To my knowledge, we've never spent money that we did not advertise for. If we ever did that or a project came up, the easy fix to that is just re-advertise to the public that we're going to take an amended capital outlay ad.
One of the things I see, the purchase of instructional materials, delivery truck, have we, I don't, that's, maybe I missed something. I mean, I know we didn't buy the 10 school buses last year, and that's on there this year, and I would imagine that Dr. Moxley will review that and make sure that that's a valid purchase.
And it doesn't mean we will purchase it.
It's just an
It just gives us
opportunity to
the
do that.
It gives us the ability
ability to do that. If
should we
our
need to.
warehouse truck breaks down during the year and we need to emergency purchase one.
So in other words, the items here that are advertised are within the legal limits of
Scope of
what we
that.
can do.
Kind of gives you, you can go up to, but you can't go outside. If I didn't have it, then you'd have to do a new ad. This at least says if something comes up.
Better to
Great.
put it all there.
Yes.
Thank you.
Next, page 13 is your big budget summary. These numbers will tie back to the numbers on the prior pages about the overall budget. Your millage rate's the same as the 5.690. This ad is also prescribed by Department of Revenue. Can't change any of the wording. All we get to do is change the numbers around. We've already sent the ads to the Department of Revenue. I always like to send them for them to look at, to make sure I didn't make a calculation error, or if I didn't read the manual right. They reviewed the ads and said everything's fine. So everything's good. Again, this is tentative. When we come to you in, this approves the ads. When we come to you in July, these numbers might change, they might not, but for the final, they will change. But you may not necessarily, we don't have to re-advertise again. It just basically changes the overall 1920 budget. We'll give you another one of these and a variance to show you this is what you saw today, this is what you're gonna see in September, so you'll be able to see the changes, but you don't have to re-advertise. The key item for the advertisement is your millage rates and your tentative budget, which is tentative, therefore it can subject to change.
And this is what starts the process.
Correct.
Right now.
You have certain timelines and days within the trim calendar that you must meet, such as once you review and approve this today, we have 2 to 5 days to get them in the paper. After that trigger's pulled, then you have X number of days to come back to you with the tentative budget and tentative millage rates. You have to approve those, and then you have X number of days to do the final. And this is all triggered upon the property appraiser. He has to have his information to put in the trim notice to send out to all the taxpayers.
I do have a question. A couple of years ago, we had some last-minute changes, and we really got smacked on our hands by the public because it seemed not to be transparent, because we didn't bring it back into a public setting and discuss what those changes are. Are we going to do that, or?
Well, and we can certainly talk about how you would like to make sure that we have safeguards against that. So right now, tonight, you will consider on your agenda the approval of the advertisement, and then on the 30th, you will approve a tentative budget. So between July 30th and September, whatever the date is in the first part of September for your final, I suggest we have additional budget workshops in there to address any changes that might come along the way, so we're very transparent.
Okay.
If you would prefer to do those in a business meeting as opposed to a workshop, then that would be something you would have the option to do with it. You're not approving anything, we're just actually
Reviewing.
going through the development and tweaking. But I think it's important to be transparent. I think that's really important, and because these are televised, I think the public can tune in. And so that would be my suggestion, is that we still schedule workshops to bring any updates. If there are none, then there are none. If there are some, then we're very transparent about it.
Very good. Any questions on the budget summary? And that's it.
Mrs. Rosario, do you have any questions?
Didn't do the PowerPoint that had the ads.
No, I'm okay. I'm just trying to follow along. I only recently received the handout that you all had, so I was trying to play catch up, but I don't have any specific questions at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions? Mrs. Barrenborg or Mrs. Justice, before we move on? Okay.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is the board office budget. This was one that you all had discussed previously about, and it's under, I think, tab 3 in your binder. This is where you had discussed your particular budget. Each department gets their budget. We rolled over what we did last year, and then if they were instructed if there's anything new or addition that they wanted to bring to the table, they would need to bring that individually to us. So in your, under agenda item number 3, you should have, I think it's 2 pages, they are front to back. Okay, this would be for the budget workshop. Pause and make sure that everybody has that.
Mrs. Zork, can we take a 3-minute recess while we move on right now, just to make sure that we all have our materials, please?
Sure, thank you. All right, we're going to take 3 minutes. We'll come back at 10.
Where in our book?
Thank you.
Okay, if you go to the budget workshop, not the workshop for this afternoon.
We're going to call this workshop meeting back to order. At this time, we are in the beginning discussion of the board office budget. Dr. Moxley.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Zork. Board members, you have before you a draft of your department's budget. So each department, each school has a discretionary budget. This is yours, and I think one of the board members had asked that we bring this specifically for you to take a look at, as we should. So when you look at the page 1 of 3, you're going to see the breakdown of your budget. We actually have the 18-19 original budget, we have the 18-19 actual expenditures, and then we have the 19-20 draft budget. So the 18-19 gives you, those 2 columns give you some historical pieces, and then, of course, the 19-20 is what we want to look at. That's what's built into your tentative budget that will be approved next Tuesday. So we try to look at some of the things that we had talked about. I added in there for the superintendent search, because sometime during the 19-20, you'll be doing that. That probably is a little high in there, and so I just wasn't sure where the proposals would come. From past experience, I've seen them all over in a range. I think the proposals you'll see this afternoon are very tight. But there's some other costs associated that are outside of that. So again, that's a little high, so you may want to, we may want to scale that back, your call there. I think that'll depend on your conversation this afternoon. Then you're going to see travel we put in there because we know that there are, if you're participating in any of the FSBA, the 2 trainings a year that are they're both in Tampa. If you're choosing to go to those, we wanted to make sure that you had a budget in there. If you're not choosing to go to those and you don't use that budget, then certainly that would roll over and become available for something else. There was a question about color copier.
And Dr. Moxley, I need to make a correction to the note off to the right, the color copier. This is a quote that we received. It's $1,133.28 annually.
Not 11,000?
Not 11,000, yes.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you for that.
Yes, yes.
It's a very
It's
expensive color
$1,100
copier.
$1,100.
And that's for a 60-month lease, so it'd be $94 a month cost.
So the question there is, you're going to see that the budget there for the copier is $250, which is what you've always had.
Right.
But if you want to upgrade to a color copier, then we would need to change that budget from 250 to the 1133. Okay, we did not, that's at your direction, so we did not make that change yet. So if that's something you deem you want to do as a board, we will certainly change that budget item.
We're talking about the little copier that's in Nancy's office?
Yes.
Currently, if Mrs. Espin wants to, I guess, print something in color, she needs to do it upstairs, or we do with our printing through the print shop. I think that's something that, in going over this, Dr. Moxley, to be honest with you, I'd like to speak with Nancy. I mean, I feel that Nancy maybe should be a part of this conversation. I can't really make a judgment as to,
She certainly can be part of the conversation. I believe that the copier upgrade came at the request of a board member
oh,
and
okay.
not from Nancy. So I think that's why we
It
put
was
it
not
here.
this board member, but if,
That
it- but,
we felt like as a board, you needed to have a conversation about it.
I believe I was the board member who brought it up.
Okay, but,
Can you all hear me?
yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I believe I was the board member who brought it up in conversation with Nancy several times in her preparation. It has been really difficult for her to get copies necessary, sometimes even 1 or 2 copies or a packet of copies, and she has to go upstairs or wait for the print shop. So that's one of the reasons why I brought it up. But I agree with asking Nancy her opinion. I'm certainly in support of whatever would help her with her position.
All right. So is this time to talk
We
about
can
it?
certainly, yes, we
Okay.
can certainly,
So-
yes, we need to get your budgets
Nancy
finalized.
or Mrs. Esplin, is this something that you feel that is a necessary cost
She'll have
or
to come
or
and speak.
convenience?
I think with as,
It's on.
with as many costs, as many copies that are made were for color, I don't believe that it would warrant. We own the copier that's in my office currently and had electrical outlets. We just have to have IT work on a drop that we can move it locally, because one of the concerns was accessibility to the copier nights and weekends when the board members are here and I'm not, because my office is locked. Which that can be moved now at any given time once the lines are dropped. And, but we only pay $250 a year for the maintenance and any overages for the copier. So the amount of color copies that we make or that I make for any of you are pretty minuscule to really warrant a color copier.
Okay, so the leasing of this, does that include the ink? Or is that additional?
No,
Because that gets really expensive.
I believe this is just the rental of the copy machine. Your ink, your paper would come out of a supply.
Okay.
My
Well, I-
understanding is that quote is for maintenance, and it should incorporate the ink, but I can confirm that.
Okay.
Well, I don't really see that's an expense that we need to add this year for a color copier, because if we have a copier that's paid for, I know the colored ink gets really expensive, and when we do our agenda books, she has to send that over to the printer anyways, and they have the color copier over there. Personally, over the last 2.5 years, I can only, maybe 2 or 3 times you had to go upstairs and get a color copy for me. So I'm not really thinking my personal opinion, I don't think it's an expense that we need to accrue right now, but I'm open.
I agree. I think if we have it, then it'll be used more, and we'll start to see that cost go up.
Well, what I don't understand is why do we have a $1,100 quote? I mean, you can go to Office Depot and get a color copier or a color printer, for a couple $100. It doesn't necessarily need to be $1,100 color printer. That's what I don't understand. I mean, is there any way to purchase something at a smaller, for a smaller amount that would just allow her the opportunity to do whatever she needs to do if there's 1 or 2 or 3 copies needed rather than $1,100?
Mrs. Rosario, from my personal experience, and I'll let the other board members chime in on this, what I have learned is through places like Staples and Office Depot, you can get a really inexpensive color copier, but what really adds up is that ink. It could be a couple $100 each time you go out to get that ink. I just think with our expenses that we have looking forward, this year we are adding the FSBA membership where we have the superintendent search. To me, if I can cut $1,100 off here, I don't see it's an expense that we need to incur right now. And I think that's the consensus that we have here today too.
No, I agree. I agree about the $1,100. I just don't agree that it's not needed maybe at a lesser amount. Maybe, like I said, a couple $100. You're talking from your perspective. I personally don't need a color copier because I have color printer in my office, and I pay for my own ink.
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about Nancy's work. This is what Nancy does. So you may not see what she does on a daily basis, but she knows it. And it's about supporting our executive, assistant in the work that she has to get done. So I agree with you in terms of the $1,100. I think that's way too high. But I also think that there might be a way for us to be able to help her do her work, easier. I mean, if anybody watches her on a daily basis, she's constantly running up and down the stairs to just make sometimes 1 or 2 copies. She could be responsible for how many colors are printed. So we don't have that extra expense of, color ink, twice a month or something like that. But I just think that we need to consider Nancy in this.
And I appreciate that consideration because I do believe that we need to make sure that Nancy's work is working smarter and not harder, and she needs to have the resources to do her job very efficiently and effectively. Board members, I recognize the consensus here is with the concern, as Mrs. Rosario's, of that $1,100. May I offer the suggestion that I will get and follow up with Nancy? We'll kind of look at her work process. Let me work with her, and then we'll find out how many times is she having to go up and down the steps, how many color copies are needed on a monthly basis. So let's look at this month. If it becomes that it is a larger amount than as we might suspect it might, or we'll confirm that it isn't. We do have color copiers in the building that everybody uses. Yes, they are upstairs. So if that becomes an inhibitor, we can always come back to this budget and amend it. So at this point in time, for the sake of moving forward, if we could just say, all right, we are going to put that on a want list over here, and let's do some data analysis. And I know that Nancy will speak up and tell me if she really needs it. And I'm asking her to do that, to be upfront and not feel inhibited to not tell us what she needs.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you. All right, if we continue on, I think you're going to see down phone service, Scripps Media. I have to say I don't know what Scripps Media is.
It's advertising.
It's your advertising, thank you. Okay, I didn't know the name of the service, so thank you.
I just like to note how expensive that is.
Yeah.
Expensive to.
And, of course, the phone service, you know, we stayed within the budget on that because that, sometimes fees change along there. We want to make sure we have that covered. Printing, obviously. Now, the interesting thing is, we budgeted $1,500. We spent that. I'm hoping with board docs, we're going to see that go down quite a bit. But we also know we're going to be in a transition. And sometimes in the transition, I know for me, when I transitioned to board docs, I still like to have a little bit of print in there. So eventually I didn't, and I became used to board docs. So we put it in there as a safeguard. I anticipate that you'll have some excess there as we transition, so just as a safety precaution there. There was an expenditure of a phone increase in 18-19. It wasn't budgeted. It was addressed, the need, and we went on.
Dr. Moxley, would that be the additional 3 phones for the new board members?
I'm not sure about that.
Yes.
Yeah, Kim Copeman saying
Okay.
yes.
That seems like a really high number. I remember seeing the quotes for the phones and how much the phone is that I asked for.
How much was it?
Um,
What kind of phone did you get?
I got the basic, whatever the basic one is. That just seems really, really high. So did something happen with that?
I would have to research that one, so what I can do, if you're asking for that information, and I see that you are, I can go back and pull the invoice and see the budget detail on that one.
Yeah, because I don't
Yeah, I thought you
remember what
said
the
as well, I
phone cost
remember.
was, but I don't remember it
Okay.
being,
12,
what's 1,300 divided by 3? Quick. Who's
Yeah,
got it?
Oh,
over
400 or
400,
something.
I mean, yeah, it's over
Yeah.
400 apiece.
Okay, it just seemed high to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know what our phones that were on under bid, what those were.
We get iPhone, I mean, I think everyone uses iPhones, right?
Right. I got whatever, the
the basic
iPhone
iPhone.
5, and it was.
I will just pull the detail of that expenditure and send it out to the board members, so you'll have
Thank you.
that.
Actually, I thought we got free,
Do we get free phones with the service? Do
that's
you get
what
the
I had
service?
thought. So
That-
how would we
thank you.
stay
So
within?
That's why I'd like to know, could we have a detailed accounting of what happened there?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Okay.
That just seemed, I thought we got free phones too with service,
Yes.
but I remember there was a phone cost, I just don't think it was that
Well, there
high.
are free phones, and then there are phones that are upgraded from there, so.
Yes, because
No.
when Dr.
I did not
Rendell left
upgrade a
his
phone,
phone,
it's a
then
tax-paid phone, it should not be upgraded. But if it's upgraded, shouldn't we pay for that?
Personally, I would, if,
Yeah,
yeah, I got
I
it
asked for
upgraded,
an
I would
upgrade
pay
for
for it.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
so that's why I'm questioning what happened with the phones.
Yeah. Yes, and I don't know, because my phone, we just transferred, you know,
Mhm.
from the previous superintendent to me.
You did
so-
change the message,
We
did you?
did,
Okay.
I did change the message, yes. I forgot at the
I
beginning.
called Dr.
but-
Moxley and I heard Dr. Rendell's voice and I called Peggy and I said, well, that's not the right message.
Yeah,
need
no,
to change
thank you,
that.
we did,
You're welcome.
yeah. Sometimes you forget about those things.
Yes.
It seems seamless. Okay, then you're going to see we added FSBA membership for the year. The question I have here is, does that include master board, or is that just the plain membership?
That's
Just plain membership.
Plain membership, so one of the things we need to look at in including in this budget is master board, if that's still the direction, and that's what I got the last time from there. So this will add the master board.
What is school resource officer meetings?
That is at our meetings, on business meetings when we hire the SRO.
Okay,
Yeah.
Comes to me.
okay.
That's attributed, we're trying to account for where our services.
Good, I like
All
that.
right.
So we
Let's make
didn't
sure we
have-
keep that line in there.
We didn't have an original?
You did not have an original budget for that,
Okay.
but we soon saw we needed to track it. So what were school SRO expenditures and what were administrative SRO expenditures, so.
Could somebody mute their phone? We hear a dog. Thank you.
Okay, and then the last item was board docs, and that is the annual membership, or the annual subscription of board docs. And so that will be reviewed annually.
So, just a question, Mrs. Ork, may I? Thank you. Can we go over quickly the process if a board member has a request for a purchase? How that works? If we could talk about that quickly and how any increase to the board budget works, I'm a little unsure. And then, you know, I don't know, I guess, how other board members are made aware of a request by a board member for a purchase in general. So how does that work? Because I've not served as chair, you've served as chair.
May I
Go
start the
ahead.
conversation, because it really depends on how you want to go with this. But I will tell you, based on new legislative action, there are some criteria for board member travel. So, which would impact your travel budget. Even though you have a budget item, there are some parameters now that if it is over a certain amount, and I want to say it's $500, it needs to come before the board, and the board has to take action on that, and you have to be transparent about that. So in considering that protocol, we need to kind of, here's the process or the procedure that we're going to follow on that. So when you choose to go to FSBA, I would suspect that one might come close to the 500, or even if it's 501, it would need to come. So your travel, if obviously it's in Tampa, if you stayed overnight 1 or 2 nights, that would, come to the board. If you think it's going to come close, and maybe it ends up being $499, I would still, if it's that close, you're safer to bring it, be very transparent about it, and we're on the same page with that. I suspect if we follow a similar protocol, that if a board member wants to make a purchase, you would make that known. We could bring that at a workshop setting, either on the superintendent's workshop. We could just put an item in there on purchase request, or board member, however you want to do that.
I guess I just wanted a historical perspective, perhaps, on how it's functioned over the course of the past year.
Well, I did it with board docs.
Right,
Brought
no,
it
I
to
mean,
Right.
I mean something more specific, like,
Oh.
you talked about upgrading your phone, like, if you wanted
Right.
to get, like, I don't know, an iPad or something, right? And that's not something that's provided to us as a board member. What's been the process in the past?
I believe all those requests goes to,
Does the chair sign off on that? Is the superintendent that signs off?
there was a question about an electronic that come to me, and I think we checked on it, and Mrs. DiAgresta had said that was something that the superintendent was to work with the board member on that. Do you recall that?
Yes, I'm not going to be able to quote the board policy, but we do have a very brief bylaw that provides that board members, when they join the board, are given a certain number of items, if you will, a phone, a laptop, whatever those items are, and that they're to work through the superintendent with regard to those items. So we could certainly put some more detail in that bylaw, put a process together, but to my memory, and I can't think of the number at the moment, but there's a board bylaw that says, just very generally, that they're to go through the office of the superintendent, board members are.
So may I ask a clarifying question? So in that bylaw, it does say, here are the items that a board member gets when they come on, and they work with the superintendent to get those. I think my question would be, if this were something outside of those designated things, yes, they would come to the superintendent for the actual processing of the purchase, but the authorization of it, I think, is the one that is really where I would have question, is that something the board wants, I can do that, or is that something, because it impacts your budget, that you would all as a board want to be aware of?
It's a budget amendment. I would want to be aware of it as a board member, I think. That's my personal feeling.
I agree,
Yeah, I
because
agree.
this budget reflects, this is all our budgets.
Right.
It's not just, even though one board member.
We need to be transparent.
Right.
I'm not saying that I would say, oh, absolutely. I mean, if someone had
Right.
a reason why, maybe I travel or I have another job and this is an easier thing for me, I'm not saying that as a board member I would say, oh, absolutely not. I just think it's something that, just being respectful to the budget, that we should all just make a
So I
decision
think
together.
my question is, there are times where I ask Nancy to print things for me, and sometimes she'll have to send it over to the print shop because she can't do it on her.
Yeah,
her
but that's
printer.
work-related.
Would
I don't-
that be something the board wants to know about?
No, I don't mean
where,
that.
where's the, is
You
it like
print to your heart's content.
$50 and above?
I don't know. I just mean just in general, I just don't know what the process is, and I think it's important. We haven't done a very good job of onboarding board members. I think that when I became a board member, when you became a board member, it was all kind of fuzzy, and it was Judy had been here for so long, and everybody just kind of thought, oh, we know how this works, right? And then we had 3 new board members come on, and maybe Terry can speak to. I don't think we did a great job of saying, not necessarily even that this is what your job is, but here's what you get, here are the expectations or whatever.
I can
right?
bring up an example.
Okay.
Okay, example would be mileage. So do we get mileage when we go visit schools? Can we take a fleet vehicle? can we take a fleet vehicle when we go to Tampa? Was that an option for us?
Yeah, I didn't even put in for mileage when I went to Tampa.
Right, so I guess that's the question is, what should we be looking at, what should we not be looking at?
Yeah.
You know, it isn't a huge, high-paying job, but I want to be able to go visit all the schools and do all
Right.
those things.
It costs money, yeah.
But I also don't want to be the only one putting it in.
Right.
I don't want to eat up our budget either.
Right.
So I think that we all need to be transparent, we all need to be the same as far as what we're doing.
Right.
And, you know, if fleet vehicles are offered to us, then they need to be offered to all.
That's an interesting point, I think, and I think going forward, we're in a really interesting position because we don't know what's gonna happen in the next year with elections, whether you'll run again, if I'll run again, if there'll be 2 new board members. So maybe we could all work together with Dr. Moxley. I know we've talked about this a little bit before, and you have so much experience as a superintendent. I think you'd be very valuable in helping us to come up with a better onboarding process and an understanding of the budget for new board members.
I actually, in fact, I've made some notes and I've started to, in my mind, do a mental journal, if you will, of saying, okay, if I were starting and living through this process with onboarding a new board member, some of the things that I would suggest at that time would be, I used to do what I called Finance 101.
Yeah.
And so within 2 months of a new board member coming on board, I offered Finance 101, and we actually took a 2-hour, and the new board members came. I opened it up, at one point I had every board member attending it was a little
I would
seminar.
come. You
It
wanna do
would be a-
Finance
it
101,
would
I'll be
a-
there.
It would be a seminar. The other thing is that I put together a onboarding notebook. And so within a month after a board member was elected, I invited them in and I walked through, you know, procedures. Here's telephone logs, but I gave them like the little handbook, if you will, of just pertinent information, you know, departments, you know, just different things. So they didn't have to, yes, it's available on the web, but this was all there together and just helped with that. So there is an onboarding protocol, if you will, that can be done, and I would suggest that. And and from experience, I can, you know,
And I think we
kind
have
of
a
put some of
foundation.
that together,
We have a
yes.
foundation for that. I know that Judy had something that she had given, and I know Nancy
Right.
had worked on it with Dr. Rendell, but I think it could be improved upon.
Right.
And I think
Right.
it would be really valuable to have the new board members' input on some of that.
I think the things that you're talking about, what are the, how do you all want to go about travel expenditures? I think we can have a conversation about
It's
that.
a good workshop. I mean, I think it's a good discussion item
Sure.
for us to have together as a board with the.
I want to agree with everybody, you know,
Yeah.
I want
I agree.
one board member to do one thing and
Right.
others not to
Well,
know about it.
Are we looking at $10,000 for travel this year?
That is,
'Cause I
that's,
don't feel
that's,
comfortable with that.
okay, so that is just looking at, okay, so if you're going to attend the June and the December FSBA meeting, which is 3 days. So you would, if you went to all 3 days, you know, I don't know whether you would or you wouldn't, but we just said if 5 board members attended FSBA and each trip is $500, so if you attended both meetings, let's round it up to $1,000. I think it's a little higher than that. but-
Just the registration alone.
And then, yes, and then you would be at about $6,000 just for FSBA twice a year biannual meetings for 5 board members. Now, maybe all 5 of you wouldn't go every time, but we just budgeted that. So 6,000 of that 10 is related to attendance at FSBA members. Now, I don't know whether we put the master board in there or not, I don't think so. But then the other remaining 4,000 is for if you were claiming any mileage going from school to school, you know, however you did that. I'm not sure, Nancy, what else was in that.
The registration alone for FSBA for the
It's like
conferences is,
$300.
it's around 400, I think,
Yeah.
365 or 400 for members. And if you're not a member,
Right.
it's around 5.
So I would venture to guess probably $7,500 is related to FSBA trainings
And
and
to,
in-service.
just as a note, Mrs. Zork, I think it's interesting, I think you're right, it is a lot of money. However, given what we have lived through in the past year, in some of the discord in this board, and the things we have gone through, I think our community would gladly pay for us to go for training. That is my opinion.
You know what? It doesn't hurt to have the money sitting there. We can always move it.
The training will be invaluable for the future of board members in this community.
But we're having board training,
Mrs. Zork, this also includes the legislative liaison travel. I think it's $1,500.
Which is
And the-
important. We've taught, we just had a conversation about the importance of advocacy. You know, I mean, let's not be penny wise and pound foolish with things like this.
If you don't mind, whenever you, I'd like to chime in whenever appropriate.
go ahead.
I think every profession, either in the business world or in the educational world, every profession has a certain number of amount reserved in their budget for professional development. And that is appropriate, it's prudent for every individual to grow in their profession, to learn the newest, the latest, the most updated information that's related to whatever their profession is. We are elected officials, and it would be equally prudent of us to be given the opportunity for professional development in our area as well. To have board members, what I understand had been past practice for many, not all, is that they just want to sit in the seat and not be a part of any professional growth. I don't find that is responsible to their position. I think it's incredibly important for all board members to be given the opportunity to have professional growth, to participate in these trainings, to learn whatever it is that they can learn. I've learned a tremendous amount from FSBA in just a short period of time, and that is not receiving Finance 101 and not receiving an onboarding notebook or onboarding training as a new board member. So you kind of come into a position blinded without any of this prior information. So had we not gone to FSBA in December when we did, or November, whenever it was that we went, I feel that it would have put me in a disadvantage to begin this position without that training. So I'm grateful that we went, that I went. And I look forward to future training. So I can see where the $10,000 looks pretty top-heavy there, but as was mentioned, to have it sit there, to have it available doesn't necessarily mean that every board member will use it. The same way with the $50,000 for the new superintendent search, we may not get that far. You know, we may not need $50,000. We may need only $20,000 or $25,000. And so then, you know, we're just kind of over budgeting just to make sure that it's always better to be over than to be under. So I hope that we can find consensus in this as well. One of the questions that I had with regard to training, and the superintendent may have mentioned it, is the board docs training. Since we're on the topic of professional development and training, I don't see board docs training included in this budget for 1920. So whenever we're ready to get there, I just wanted to throw that question out since I'm on the phone. I am in support of the $10,300 travel expense for all 5 board members, but also my last question was about board docs training. So thank you.
May I answer the board docs? With board docs, that training is included in that cost. So that
Okay,
fee
thank you.
includes the onboarding training that we have being scheduled in August. So it is inclusive
Okay.
of that price.
Okay, so my opinion on the 10,300 is gonna stay that I feel like it's very excessive. Yes, we can go twice a year, but does that mean we do go? I mean, are there other ways, just like we tell our school leadership to try to find these various trainings, seminars that can be online or Skype versus having to have that travel expense. So for me as a board member, you don't have to, I don't want that much money. And when I look at when we budget, I do know that we asked our schools to be as close to what the actual budget is as possible. And I don't feel comfortable padding our budget just in case we might use it. I mean, because we ask our schools to not do that. So I don't feel like we should be doing that.
I appreciate your fiscal conservatism, Mrs. Sork. I agree with you in theory. In practice, my experience in going to FSBA, in meeting other board members, in board members that have had a lot of experience, new board members, different people in business and their perspectives on school governance, and it has been invaluable. When I entered this board, we had been in a period of time where we had kind of receded from any type of membership. And we were in this bubble in Indian River County. And being in a bubble and not advocating at a statewide level for funding, equal funding, level funding, any of those things when we talked about 13 other districts, I truly believe that we put ourselves at a disadvantage and we do not serve taxpayers to the best of our ability when we close ourselves off from the rest of the state. One of the things that I've so enjoyed with the membership with the Central Florida School Board Association is the power of the advocacy of representing over 1 million students. When you go and you sit in that room with other superintendents and school board members, and you have the power to advocate together, you're so much stronger than you are as one person. This is a part-time job. It truly is meant to be a part-time job. The superintendent runs the school district. But there are certain things about being a school board member where you can advocate in a legislative level with your representatives and state senate, with your senators, different things that I think when you enter into that arena and you go and when you're networking and you're talking to people and you're learning about other experiences, it has made me a better board member. It truly has. It has made me think bigger, be more creative. I have met people that have helped me along the way to understand school finance. And while I recognize that it is a significant amount of money, and I take all taxpayer money that we spend, every penny, as a taxpayer and a homeowner, as a parent of 4 children, I take it very seriously. I think that our job as a school board member is to do our job to the best of our ability with as much information as possible. Information is power. And again, the FSBA membership, or just going to the meetings and not even having been a member has helped me grow as a person. So I'll continue to support this.
I think this may help. Nancy Esplin was just double checking, and she has confirmed that this $10,000 does include the master board
Great.
training. Am I correct in
Yes,
that?
the 42.
So that's why it's larger.
Wonderful.
So master board would not be every year that that is in here, so that may make it a little, that's why it looks larger than probably
Okay.
it would on a yearly basis.
Yeah, there was also money placed in there, funding for the Central Florida Public School Board Coalition. If more than one was driving for mileage, there was $500 put in for the executive assistant to attend FAD's
Training.
one time a year.
Okay.
I mean, that's all important
right.
stuff. Just for the record, the Central Florida School Board Association membership is about $100 a year.
Yeah.
It's a
It's
minimal
more a
cost, but
mileage,
it's,
a mileage
and I've never put
thing.
in for mileage
Yeah.
for that, but I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
again, that's something I think we
Yeah.
have to talk about.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it is an important discussion. What is that 10,300
Well, that
representing?
makes more
So,
sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I know the rest of our time this morning, we want to work with the TAN as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are we,
I'm fine with this if you are okay with this.
anybody
Yeah,
else?
I have a question.
Okay. Go
I
ahead.
have a couple of questions. The first question, I don't know if this was addressed. I thought it was addressed earlier. I may have missed it. Where do the electrical outlets come from this? Does that come out of capital or does that come out of our budget?
That would come out of
Added.
maintenance.
I'm sorry?
That would come out of our maintenance budget.
Okay, okay. And then I'm looking at the salaries, the salary line. If we take our salary times 5, it doesn't come out to 217.
You also have Nancy Esplin's salary.
Nancy, okay, okay.
One of the options
then
with,
all of these-
Mrs. Rosario, one of the options with salary, you know, and when we talk about travel and those things, we could cut our salary. I mean, you know, we didn't take the raise in our salaries, but we could always cut it. I mean, that's an option.
What raise?
The state allows for, they increased what school board members can receive every year as a salary, and the school board in the past has voted to not increase. I know on the previous board, we voted to not take the increase, and then we kept our salary static. But I believe that the salary is a bit higher than what we currently receive. But again, that's like, you know, while we don't have a lot of control over a lot of things, we do have control over that. We could cut our salary however we wanted.
And what are the, thank you for that information, and what are the benefits here? Are these benefits, because I see that there are 4 lines of benefits. Does that mean that individual board members receive these benefits, or why are there 4 different lines? Just curious.
I'm going to let, can you address that,
It's
Ms.
the-
Copeman?
It's the FRS, their insurance,
I'm
Social
sorry,
Security,
I can't-
It's,
Medicaid.
it's FRS contribution, it's insurance, it is Social Security.
Oh, okay, okay. Thank you.
All right, if we, we'll move to our last topic, and this is the tax anticipation note. I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Fagan, and I know that we have our guests here. Thank you, Mr. Patel and Mr. Ford, for being here today.
Good morning. So we all have the PowerPoint?
Mrs. Rosario, we are now moving to the PowerPoint that is labeled Identified Tax Anticipation Note.
Thank you.
Okay,
Okay.
we're on page 2 of 10.
Correct. Yes, ma'am. So, background, Florida school districts are funded through various mechanisms, as we know, FEFP. However, based upon the formula, not all districts receive equal amounts of money throughout the year, and so the TAN was created to help districts who run into a cash crunch, an option at which to go out and borrow money. Statute is very, very specific on the way school districts can borrow money. You just can't go out and do like you can a regular loan. You have certain requirements you have to meet. The TAN is what we call the short-term mechanism that allows school districts to borrow money that are not long-term, that are not capital-based, that help with the deficits that occurred during a cash flow.
Okay?
As you know, we are property rich, therefore we get, November, December, we will get our 4 statutory requirements from the state. November installments are collected in June and September. January and March, you get twice, and then April, you get once. There are also some tax certification sales that are also held that end in June. All this is your major source of revenue for the district, and when we run the cash flow, basically when we get into October and November is when the cash crunch comes. Simply, there's not enough cash to cover all requirements. Tax anticipation note, same comments, as has been established under statute, borrow enough money to eliminate any reasonable shortfalls. Also, when you go out for a TAN, you have to have sufficient justification for any amount that you're looking for. You just can't arbitrarily say, I want to go borrow $100 million. You have to, it has to be based on your cash flow and also a 5% of your estimated expenditures for the prior year. It's kind of like the capital outlay ad. You can go up to a maximum, but you don't have to. If you want to go buy a car, I got a loan for X, but maybe I don't want to go that far. Page 5. This is a comparison that we got from Mr. Ford here of the other districts that are very similar to Indian River. who are property rich and have issued TANs during the 2018 fiscal year. These are the ones that are in red, which are Sumter, Charlotte, Indian, Palm Beach, Lee, Dade, Pinellas, Manatee, Flagler, Broward, and St. Lucie. So for other districts, much larger than us and much smaller than us, issuing a TAN is not an unusual financial instrument to help us get us through a cash crunch. It's not a great anomaly. Mr. Ford, any comments to add to this?
Just in case anybody does any sleuthing on their own, Bay County Schools did issue a TAN last year, but that was only as a result of the impact of Hurricane Michael.
Thank you. Next, page 6.
I have a question about that.
Yes.
It doesn't seem like all of these are cash-rich counties, like St. Lucie is cash-rich, property-rich. Interesting. Did not know that. How about Martin?
That I'm not sure of. I have to
Martin
check.
almost, so the state requires you to take their funds. Martin could almost survive without state funding, but the state requires you to take a certain amount of state funding because of control, because if you didn't have to take the state funding, then you could just say, we're going to do whatever we want, right? But which they don't want. Am I correct in that? But Martin has Martin has so much money. I mean,
Right, so that
They
kinda-
do what they do.
That's why I was thrown off by this, because
Yeah.
it was like, Martin's not included in this list, so how are they doing it?
it's interesting.
I don't know the answer. Do you know the answer to how, like, Monroe, Sarasota, Walton, Franklin, Collier, Collier, Sarasota, and Monroe to me were very property rich.
Yes.
And yet, in my logic over the years, it was always, well, this has been the way they've been all these years. They've adjusted their cash flow and all of that to address the situation they're in.
They're
They
keeping
have-
a higher fund
Yeah.
balance, or they're a high-growth district, so they have more funding coming in. I mean,
Yeah.
there are a number of.
Correct.
And they're pacing it differently.
Some of them maintain a higher fund balance in their general fund. Others maintain a higher fund balance in other funds, and they use inter-year transfers to cover that shortfall. Usually when a district issues tax anticipation notes, it does so with relative frequency. Maybe not every year, but you tend to see a trend over time. For some of these districts that are not listed amongst TAN issuers last year, they have issued TANs in the past. I know that Monroe County Schools had a line of credit in place for 3 years because Mr. Patel and I helped put that together. Some of these other school districts are simply so small that I really probably should have excluded the bottom 20 school districts in the state by side from this chart, just for clarity. But some districts make it a point as part of their strategy, they're going to issue a TAN every single year.
We talked about that philosophical shift, right? I mean, we've talked about this numerous times. We could raise our fund balance and just raise our fund balance. I mean, we could do that. We've made choices in adding services or doing different things when we're in bargaining. It's all about choices. If we don't want to have to issue a TAN in the future, can we set it up so we don't have to issue a TAN? Yeah, we can. We can do that. I mean, when you say that if they've done it before, they do it, because it's a philosophical choice. Or you want money sitting in a bank account, or you want it serving students? I mean, so I think this board is making a choice right now. Going forward, if you want to make a different choice, 3 votes, make a different choice. But for me personally, the idea of stockpiling money just to have it so we don't have to go through this process is not what our students need right now. When I look at kids in general, they need services, especially mental health and guidance counselors. And I mean, I'm not comfortable with stockpiling funds. I'm just not. As a mom, I'm not. So.
Well, that's not what I'm asking us to do. I'm just asking, what are they doing to avoid this? And also, looking at the legislative platform that we put forward, how can we say, okay, because it's going to be thrown back on us, what you just said, okay, well, we could stockpile the money then. That's going to be the answer.
You can, but I mean, the way that the state gives you money, and I always use the textbook allocation because I think it's the best example of that. You buy your textbooks in bulk. You buy them all at the same time, but you get your textbook allocation in a series of payments throughout the year. Doesn't make any sense. So you have to hold on to that money and grow it until you need to, but, so the funding in general is so out of the way that we need to spend it to serve students. And school districts are funded in similar ways, and school districts couldn't be more different. When you say you should exclude the bottom 20, we're talking about Union, how many kids are in Union county, in the District of Union. I mean,
I'm not sure. I know that Jefferson County has a single school.
yeah, one school. I mean, so it's not even it's not comparing apples to apples here. It's just not. So thank you for that point.
Okay,
Okay.
all right, page 7,
Page,
or
Page
page
six.
6, I'm sorry.
when issuing a TAN, there are two mechanisms. One is a public offering, and the other is a bank loan or line of credit. When you issue via a public offering, generally it allows you to have a little bit lower interest rate, but you will incur a little bit higher cost because of all the documentation and the requirements. Bank loan will give you a little bit higher interest cost, but they have lower cost of issuance. Okay. Next page, 7. Historically, we, the district, have issued TANs almost every year, starting in 2009 through 2018. Prior to 2016, they all appear to have been competitive offerings. The last two were 2 bank loans.
Mr. Fagan, were you able to look into that information I had given you on, was that Thursday?
Yes, ma'am. Got some information on Florida Local Government Finance Program. It was, we were not able to actually talk to anyone, but I was able to get with Mr. Patel, and he has an individual who works with his firm who oversees this program. This program is primarily geared for individual districts who are looking to do a capital project. They want short-term money to start the project, get the project underway, and then at some point in time in the future, issue a traditional COPS and then pay themselves back for this money. It allows them to kickstart the project before actually doing a full-blown COPS. Sometimes they're used for emergencies like hurricanes. They have a little bit lower cost of issuance, but their interest rate right now is 2.81%. Our interest rate that we're looking at to issue our TAN is probably 1.25%. So you save on the cost of issuance, but you'll pay on the interest. Very similar to maybe like a bank loan, but not quite as restrictive. The mechanics at which to get the loan are a little bit more challenging. Anytime you do a drawdown, you actually go to the board and say, I want to draw another $1 million. If you were doing them in succession. If it was a one-time draw, you don't go one time. So we did look at it, but based upon the cost of the interest rate that was allocated currently right now, all-in-one was 2.81. That's significantly higher than what we're looking at in the market right now. So it didn't seem to be a good fit for us right now.
Right now.
If the market was different, we may be comparing this one to a traditional bank loan and say, well, they're 2.8, the bank loan is 2.7, let's go that route. Also, I believe they haven't actually issued a TAN under this program in probably 10 years. Most of them have been capital and infrastructure projects.
All right, well, thanks for
And
taking
I
a
think
double look at that.
I think it's important that every year you look at the options because the market changes. Okay.
Page 8. The TAN that we're seeking board approval for this year is via public offering, not a bank net. Total proceeds not to exceed $15 million. Keep in mind that when we go to the market, if the market turns or it's not in our best interest, we can kill the deal. So just because you give us approval doesn't lock anything in. Once we get the solicitations in and look at it, if it's not in our best interest, we'll say thank you, but no thank you.
I'm glad to hear that.
And then another course of action has to be taken.
Okay.
Maturity for this one, if we borrow the full $15 million, would be approximately $15.1 million. Net interest, right now, based upon the market, and I'll let Mr. Ford add, based on some current deals that he has seen, is we're probably looking to borrow somewhere around 110, 124, 125. That's a constantly moving number, but we're projecting about a 1.24. And Mr. Ford, I believe you know of a couple of transactions that have closed recently?
I do. So the only TAN, as a matter of fact, the only competitive note at all that's been issued in the state of Florida this year was last week. It was $160 million. It was the Broward County School Board Tax Anticipation Note. It priced at a yield of a 1.16. I think that is a little bit lower than we would price at today if we were in the market, simply because that size carries some weight, and being the first note out of the gate in Florida this year addresses some of the fund's needs for Florida paper. So I think that 125 today is a pretty reasonable target. Again, those numbers will continue to move between now and whenever we price. They'll go up, down, or sideways and there's no way to tell exactly which way that will go. But right now, that's where we see the market.
Okay?
So that's 120, or let's say 125,000 in interest, is that what we're talking about
We're
here?
looking at roughly 125,000 in interest.
Plus the 68,000,
Correct.
Correct. Closing costs run approximately 68,000.
okay.
The maturity on this note is set for April 30th. And the current investment rate, based upon the two investment houses that we have, are running about 2.5, 2.6%. So in essence, we're looking to borrow at about 1.25, and any residual money will be invested at 2.6. That's not a guarantee, though. The market is changing. If the market does start to move, we have some investment opportunities where we might be able to see if we can take any of the residual money, invest it, and lock in that rate, where ultimately, when we get through with this, we hope the cost to issuance versus the interest is break even. Not necessarily looking to make money, we're simply to neutralize all possible costs. The market currently allows for this because you have this inverse yield curve, where long-term rates are lower than short-term rates.
So I do have a, are you going to review the charts from previous years on the yield rates? Because 2.55 right now, we're at an all-time high. So my question is, the market's really good right now. Can you explain what's changed in the market to help us yield the 2.55?
On the investments, a lot of things. Over the past several years, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates a number of times during the financial crisis and for many years afterward. They had their target rate between 0 and 25 basis points. That was an all-time low. It lasted for a long time, and economic historians will tell you those were the lowest rates in recorded history. Since that time, we've had several step-ups in the Federal Reserve rate. Right now, the rate range is from 225 to 250. It does appear that there is they're calling it a 100% probability, whether or not the economists are right on that or not, I'm not sure, that the Federal Reserve will lower its target rate at the end of this month. Most people are calling for a 25 basis point rate cut. Some people are calling for a 50, but it looks like the 25 is certainly the more widely expected number. Tax exempt rates, and that's a big part of this. You have the ability to borrow on a tax exempt basis. So investors are willing to give you an interest rate that's much, much better than they would your corporate counterpart like Apple or IBM or somebody like that. So you can borrow money on a tax exempt basis, but then you can go and you can invest your money in investments that are otherwise taxable. So you get to keep that arbitrage on those, and as long as rates on the taxable don't fall over time, you're going to be able to neutralize a lot of your cost or maybe even come out ahead.
But it's important as a school district, the goal is not to come out ahead. The goal is to neutralize costs. And
Your
if we
goal is to
do happen
neutralize
to
your
do
cost.
that, then it is the benefit of the good decision-making.
Yes, ma'am.
So in 2017, the anticipated yield, let's say in July, was 1.29. 2018's 2.225, and we're looking at about 2.55. So in 2018, 2017, this model that we have here today, where we would break even in borrowing these funds, it wouldn't have been able to be feasible, correct? Because the interest rates on the reinvestment wasn't as high as it is right now.
I can't say whether or not it would have been possible at that time. Speaking for 2018, we did not anticipate that there would be a tax anticipation note issuance until it was pretty late in the game.
Okay.
And then it was a case of, we need to
Hurry
put this
up.
in place now. And public offerings do take more time to put together. They've got documents, they've got advertising that's required. It simply takes more work and more time to get them out the door. So a bank loan was really the only option last year. 2017, you did not issue a tax anticipation note. And in 2016, I believe it was a decision by staff simply to go with a bank loan. Did not want to analyze necessarily positive arbitrage at that time, if I remember. So we simply looked at what is the overall cost. We want to pay this money back as quickly as possible. What is the overall cost? And I did quite a bit of analysis between a bank loan and the public market at that time, and the bank loan was slightly beneficial to the public market. So that's the direction we went. As I recall, the difference was less than $10,000.
Any questions?
That day has passed.
This evening on your business agenda, you do have the tax anticipation note resolution to be approved. That authorizes us to move forward. However, what Mr. Fagan did state, and I want to reemphasize, that we will constantly monitor the market with Mr. Ford's help. And if there is a drastic change in that, that poses a different solution, that would certainly come back to you. We don't have to move forward if it becomes a different ballgame. Am I correct on that?
Yes, you are.
So is that something that we'd have to be brought back, we vote on, so we can't act immediately on it then?
I'm going to look for some direction here on if for some reason the market were to drastically change and we would not want to move forward with the tax anticipation note, and we'd need to look at other things. Does that come back and they have to undo or take action to counter the resolution approval, or we just don't act on that, and it would come back to them to act on whatever the new option was?
So there's two items. First is the authority. It's delegated authority under the resolution, and sorry, I'm stepping on your toes a little bit here, but the superintendent and staff is under no obligation to fulfill your authority to go out and issue a TAM. But the resolution is set up for a public offering. So if the public market fell apart, we still have the need to address our cash flow shortfall this year. So we would have to come back to you with another resolution for another solution to this problem, probably a TAN via bank loan or something of that nature.
Or a smaller amount, because we don't necessarily need the 15 million, but based on the reinvestment interest rate, if I'm using the term right, that's where we're able to even out.
But they wouldn't have to bring that back to us. We've delegated authority for 15 million. If they want to go for a smaller
for-
amount, then
for
they
not
have the
to
authority
exceed.
to do
Right.
that.
But they're coming to us, telling us that it's going to, we're not going to really incur any fees or interest because we're earning on the back end to wipe out those fees. If the market was to tank, I would want to know how much are those fees and how much is that interest going to cost us?
Right, well, I mean, they're saying if the market did, and they're not going to go out for a public offering, they're going to have to bring something else back, and there'll be a new resolution. But once we delegate authority for 15 million in public offering in this way, now we're out. Now we're not making other decisions. Now the decision is left to staff, as it has been, by the way, in the past. There was never, even before,
Well, and I would respond to that in this way, that if for some reason they're going out and we have up to not to exceed $15 million, if the conditions end up being 11 million, while we have the authority to do that, I would still communicate with you to
of
update
course.
you.
But we
on
don't have
that,
to issue
but-
a new resolution for that
Correct.
amount.
That is correct. So, great.
I have just a little clarifying question, if that's okay.
Yes.
We were just talking about the difference between, or rather, going for a TAN. And then I heard public offering. And then I heard bank loan, line of credit. So if the market does not do well, what are we approved, well, let me go back. What is going to come to us tonight specifically for approval? Is it to issue the TAN, to move forward with issuing the TAN, or issuing a public offering?
Resolution.
And then if the market tanks, I also heard that other options would have to come before us. What would those other options be at that point?
Sure. It's a good question. My apologies. I'll clarify a little bit. A tax anticipation note is any loan that you take out for the purposes of addressing your cash flow shortfall. But the way in which you get that loan can be done through the public market or through a loan from a bank or through a line of credit for a bank. It's still a tax anticipation note. So the resolution before you tonight allows for a tax anticipation note to be issued via competitive public offering. If we wanted to change that and come back to you for a direct bank loan or a line, or the CP program, we would have to come back to you with something different for that.
And what would that something different be?
It would be a whole new resolution.
For what? What would be the options at that point?
A bank loan or a bank line of credit or some other alternative, like possibly the commercial paper program that Mrs. Zork referred to.
I'm sorry, like what? Because I didn't hear you.
A bank loan or a line of credit from a bank or some other
Right.
funding alternative, potentially like the commercial paper program that Mrs. Zork referred to.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
Mr. Ford, just to reiterate, last year it was a rush process. And we weren't put in the best situation that we probably could have been in, but having this brought to us in May or June, it's put us in a better standing, correct?
It has, and your
To be
staff
able
has
to
worked very hard to make
prepare
that
and-
possible.
Okay. Anything else on that, Mr. Fagan?
No, ma'am.
On the TAN?
And that concludes the items that we had on our agenda to bring before the board for the board workshop. I really want to thank Mr. Patel and Mr. Ford and Ms. Copeman and Mr. Fagan for their hard work over the last 2 months that I've worked with them. They've provided great expertise and guidance and helped answer literally 100 different questions that we've had along the way. We want to do this right. We want to do it transparently. And use the taxpayers' money to advance education for students correctly. So that concludes our workshop on this item.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? Are you good? Okay. We are going to adjourn this meeting at 11:03.